Canberra.
Well, the US midterm elections will take place on Wednesday. These elections should play a decisive role in shaping the US political landscape for the coming years, not only setting the scene for President Obama's final 2 years in office, but having a significant impact on the 2016 presidential election. To explore this more, I'm joined now by Professor Bates Gill, Chief Executive of the US Study Centre at the University of Sydney. Professor Gill, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, just set the scene for us as to how crucial these midterm elections are, because, I mean, perhaps many Australians, many Americans, as we're seeing by some of the polls, say, oh, you know, a bit ho-hum, midterm elections. They're not the presidential elections.
Right.
What do they point to in coming years, in your view?
Well, the important thing to recall is that only 1/3 of the seats of the Senate are going to be up for election in this particular go-round. So it's not the entire Senate that's going to be voting for. But what's important, I think, in the message here is the trend line that is going so strongly against Democrats, particularly in local or state elections. That's going to mean, I think, a strengthening in the Congress, certainly, a strong hand for the Republicans going forward, so that no matter who the president is, if it's a Democrat next time, in 2016, they're going to be likely facing a Republican Congress on both sides in the House of Representatives as well as in the Senate.
Okay, well, given that President Obama is polling very poorly in popularity, is Barack Obama likely, you know, you're saying he's going to potentially, or the Democrats are potentially going to decrease their power, but what will happen to his power, his ability to govern and get his legislative agenda through?
Well, President Obama is actually not doing so badly compared to other presidents at the same time in their terms in office. So it's typical for American presidents to be weaker, of course, when they've only got about 2 years left to go in office, the so-called lame duck syndrome.
Sure.
So he would have been up against a real fight anyway. What's going to happen, though, now, if as predicted by almost all polls, the Republicans take control of the Senate, that's just going to mean, I think, probably further deadlock in Washington, and that any hopes of certain reform, maybe around immigration reform, around energy policy reform, maybe improving things like the minimum wage in the United States, which are certainly on Barack Obama's agenda, very, very unlikely that they're going to see any passage in the months and years ahead for the remainder of his term.
So it really is going to be a lame duck presidency for the next 2 years.
More than likely, it's certainly in the sense that Congress would join with the president to pass any sort of meaningful legislation. Some people argue that this will force the president to compromise across a number of issues. I'm not so sure about that. I think what we'll likely see instead is the president continuing to push his agenda through executive action, and the deadlock remaining between the two ends of Pennsylvania Avenue.
All right, but can he do things like his minimum wage, lifting the minimum wage? Can he do that through executive action? Can he bring in or improve their climate change policy that way?
Only sort of around the margins,
yeah,
and to the degree it affects the federal government itself, rather than, you know, broadly across all wage earners, for example.
So he's really going to be hamstrung.
Well, I think, you know, typically presidents at this time of their in office, especially when they're facing a stacked deck against them on Capitol Hill, tend to put a lot more time into foreign policy questions where the president has a great deal more leeway. And that's maybe we'll see the president trying to burnish his legacy on that side of the agenda.
What impact could these elections have on, say, the 2016 presidential race and perhaps on Hillary Clinton's chances, not only of running, but if she does run, her chances of winning? Or is it way too far ahead?
It probably is a little bit too early, but I think, you know, it could slice both ways. If the Republican majority in Congress is able to push ahead on some meaningful reform, if they're able to pass legislation which the president is prepared to sign, and they can point to a constructive agenda, well, then that's probably going to be a good thing for whoever is nominated to run for president as the Republican next go-round.
But didn't you just say they were going to most likely be blocking?
Well, the problem here is that I don't think the Republican-led Congress is likely to want to put forward legislation constructively, which the president would be in a position to want to sign. So that's really where it boils down to, is can this Republican-led Congress demonstrate leadership, demonstrate a constructive agenda, rather than one that is trying to obstruct. And that, I think, is going to be a determining factor on whether or not in the next presidential election in 2016, the Republicans are able to position themselves as having the more constructive agenda.
Right, so you mean if they are blocking this next couple of years, the population may kind of turn against them and then vote again for a Democrat. But if they're seen to be constructive, that might help them get a Republican in the White House?
It would certainly help, because I think the demographics are really stacked against the Republicans at a national level, which is going to make it hard for any Republican candidate to do well at the presidential level. So anything that the Republican-led Congress can do to at least bolster the Republican image, that's only going to help any potential candidate going forward for them.
And in your view, Professor Gill, is President Obama stuck, seemingly paralysed about making decisions, as many are criticising him for?
I think the president's, one of his challenges is improving his relationship with Congress. And that includes within his own party in Congress, for that matter. I think most outsiders believe that the president has a very deliberative style, has a relatively close-knit circle of advisors with whom he consults, and is not as successful then at broadening that circle and reaching out to Capitol Hill, and again, not only with his own party, but and certainly not with Republicans. And that has stymied him, I think, in being able to push ahead some of his agenda.
All right, Professor Bates Gill from the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll watch with interest.